Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're going to try to wrap our heads around something that's both familiar and kind of surprisingly complex at the same time.
Yeah.
Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Right.
You know, the idea that when individuals act in their own self-interest in a free market, it somehow ends up benefiting, like, society as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, does it really work that way?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, we've got a whole stack of sources here to try and help us unpack this. We've got a Yale economics lecture that really digs into Smith's philosophy.
Okay.
Then we've got a Khan Academy explainer on basic economic principles like supply and demand, those kinds of things.
Right.
But to get a real-world perspective, we're also going to be looking at a couple of IMF articles.
Okay.
One's on how governments actually intervene in the economy, and the other's on the fascinating and often kind of messy intersection of politics and economics.
So basically, we're going on a journey.
Yeah.
We're starting with this seemingly simple idea of the invisible hand.
Right.
And we're just going to kind of see where it leads us.
Yeah.
Hopefully by the end, you'll have a better sense of whether this invisible hand is, guiding us to a better future or just picking our pockets along the way.
Yeah, exactly. So to start, I think it's good to kind of set the scene right. Back in the 1700s,
Okay.
Adam Smith was challenging the dominant economic thinking of his time.
Which was?
Mercantilism.
Okay.
Which was all about protectionist policies and governments like hoarding wealth,
So he was like, hey, what if we just let people do their own thing?
Yeah. Pretty radical for the time, right?
Yeah, I bet.
So he argued that in a truly free market where individuals pursue their own self-interest, this invisible hand would naturally guide resources to where they're most valued.
Okay.
And that leads to greater efficiency and prosperity for everyone.
Okay, but what does that actually look like in practice? I mean, isn't the real world a lot messier than this ideal free market?
You're totally right.
Yeah.
The Yale lecture points out that for Smith's invisible hand to even have a chance of working, you need a bunch of conditions to be perfectly in place.
Mm-hmm.
Things like perfectly competitive markets with tons of small producers and consumers, no monopolies, no price fixing, and everybody having perfect information.
Right.
Oh, and you need a government that's strong enough to enforce contracts and property rights, but somehow also stays out of the way of the market.
Yeah, that's a tall order.
It is a pretty tall order.
It sounds like those conditions are almost never met in the real world.
Exactly right. And that's one of the big criticisms of classical economics.
Which is?
Well, it often relies on these idealized models that don't really reflect the complexities of human behavior or the realities of power dynamics.
Which brings us to this fascinating anecdote from the Yale lecture.
Okay.
They bring in this guy, Jim Alexander.
Oh, yeah?
Who was a former investment banker and CFO. And he basically says that while businesses love to talk about free markets, their actual strategies often contradict those principles. Mm-hmm. He's seen it firsthand.
Yeah, and what's particularly interesting is why this contradiction exists. The lecture mentions the Porter forces, which is a framework used in business schools to analyze industries and develop strategies for achieving above-average profits.
Okay, so what are the Porter forces? And how do they clash with this whole free market ideal?
Well, in a nutshell, the Porter forces look at things like the threat of new entrants, the bargaining power of buyers and suppliers, the threat of substitute products or services, and the intensity of competitive rivalry. Okay. So the goal is to find ways to reduce these competitive forces so that your company can gain an advantage and extract higher profits.
But wouldn't that go directly against the idea of a free market where competition is supposed to be the driving force?
Exactly. That's the tension between theory and practice, right?
Okay.
Businesses want the benefits of a free market for everyone else, but when it comes to their own bottom line, they often behave in ways that undermine those very principles.
So they want the invisible hand to work its magic on their competitors, but not on them.
It seems that way, yeah. And Jim Alexander has this great quote that really captures this idea.
What's that?
He says, "The invisible hand typically is picking someone's pocket, not creating value."
I think we've all felt that way at some point, right? We're the ones getting our pockets picked in this whole economic game.
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder, is it really just about self-interest?
Right.
I mean, because even Adam Smith himself didn't live like some, tycoon, did he?
It's true. He lived quite modestly and never amassed great wealth, which does seem a bit odd for the guy who basically wrote the book on capitalism.
Yeah. It's almost like he was aware of the potential downsides of unbridled self-interest.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, you mentioned that The Wealth of Nations wasn't even his most famous work during his lifetime.
Yeah, that's right. His first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was actually much more widely read at the time. And in that book, Smith explores the idea that human beings aren't just motivated by self-interest. Okay.
He argues that we also have an inherent capacity for sympathy and concern for others.
So he wasn't just about greed is good.
Not at all. In fact, the opening line of The Theory of Moral Sentiments really drives this point home.
What is it?
He writes, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it."
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
It suggests that Smith recognized a more complex human nature than just pure self-interest.
Right.
Which makes you wonder how that might have influenced his thinking about economics.
Definitely something to consider. If human nature isn't just about maximizing individual gain, then perhaps the way we think about markets needs to be more nuanced as well.
So if self-interest isn't like the whole story, then how do we explain how markets work? I mean, how do prices get determined? How do we know what to produce and how much of it?
That's where those basic economic principles come in, like supply and demand.
Remember that Khan Academy video we mentioned?
Yeah.
They use a simple example, apples, to illustrate how these forces interact.
Okay, let's dive into that. I love a good apple analogy.
So imagine you're at a farmer's market.
Okay.
If the price of apples is really high, people are going to be less likely to buy them, right?
Right.
So you'll have a surplus of apples because the supply exceeds the demand.
And to get rid of those extra apples, the sellers will probably start lowering their prices.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as the price goes down, more people are going to be willing to buy those apples, so demand will increase.
But if the price goes too low, everyone's going to want those apples, and suddenly there won't be enough to go around.
Right.
We'll have a shortage.
Exactly, a shortage. And then when there's a shortage, the sellers can raise their prices again because people are still clamoring for those delicious apples.
So it's this constant dance between buyers and sellers.
Yeah.
With the price of apples going up or down, depending on how much people want them and how many apples are available.
Right. And this dance, this interplay of supply and demand, theoretically, leads to a point where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded.
Okay.
We call this equilibrium.
Equilibrium. So like a perfect balance where everyone gets the apples they want at a price that seems fair.
That's the idea. And this is where that invisible hand metaphor comes back into play.
Okay.
In theory, when supply and demand are allowed to interact freely without any interference, the market will naturally gravitate towards this equilibrium point, resulting in efficient allocation of resources and optimal prices.
It sounds almost too good to be true. Is the real world ever that neat and tidy?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, because we haven't even factored in the role of government yet.
Right. We've been talking about this invisible hand guiding the market, but what about like the times when governments step in and make their presence known?
That's where these IMF articles come in. They remind us that, we're not just at the mercy of market forces.
Okay.
Governments can and do intervene in the economy, especially during times of crisis. It's what we call fiscal policy.
Okay, so break that down for me. What exactly is fiscal policy? And how is it different from, say, monetary policy, which I think I've heard of? But
Good question. Monetary policy has to do with controlling the money supply and interest rates, and that's usually managed by a central bank.
okay.
Fiscal policy, on the other hand, involves the government directly using its spending, taxing, and borrowing powers to influence the economy.
So like if the economy is slowing down, the government could cut taxes or increase spending to try to stimulate growth.
Exactly. Or if the economy is overheating and inflation's a concern, they could raise taxes or cut spending to try to cool things down.
Okay.
It's about trying to find that sweet spot, that balance between promoting growth and keeping inflation in check.
You mentioned government stepping in during times of crisis, like the 2007, 2008 financial crisis comes to mind.
Yeah.
That was a pretty dramatic example of government intervention, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Governments around the world had to take extraordinary measures, including massive stimulus packages and bailouts to prevent a complete economic collapse.
It makes you realize that the invisible hand sometimes needs a helping hand or maybe even a firm push in the right direction.
That's one way to look at it, but the IMF article also points out that government intervention isn't always a perfect solution.
Right.
It can have unintended consequences, and there's always a risk that the cure could be worse than the disease.
So it sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It is.
Figuring out when and how much the government should intervene. Is there even like a right answer?
That's a question economists and policymakers have been grappling with for centuries.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution. It depends on the specific circumstances, the political climate, and a whole host of other factors.
It all starts to sound incredibly complex.
It is, and we're only scratching the surface here because the IMF articles introduce another layer of complexity, the political economy of economic policy. In other words, we can't just look at economic models in isolation.
Right.
We have to understand how political forces, interest groups, and power dynamics influence the decisions that get made.
So economics is never purely about economics. There's always a political angle as well.
Right. Economic policies aren't made in a vacuum. They're shaped by who has the power, who's lobbying for what, and what the political climate is like.
The IMF article used the example of sugar subsidies in the U.S. to illustrate this point. Can you explain what that's all about?
Sure. In the U.S., sugar producers benefit from government subsidies that keep the price of domestic sugar artificially high.
Okay.
This is great for the sugar producers, of course, because they get to sell their product at a higher price.
But it means consumers end up paying more for sugar, right?
Exactly. And it also hurts other industries that use sugar as an input, like candy manufacturers or bakeries. They have to pay more for their raw materials, which can make them less competitive.
So why would the government do something that seems to hurt so many people while benefiting only a small group?
Well, that's where the political economy comes in. Sugar producers are a powerful and well-organized lobby group.
Okay.
They contribute to political campaigns, they have influence in Washington, and they've been successful at keeping these subsidies in place for decades, even though they're widely seen as economically inefficient and unfair.
So the invisible hand is getting pushed aside by a very visible and powerful interest group.
That's one way to look at it. It's a classic example of how concentrated interests can override the desires of a larger, more diffuse group, even in a democratic system.
It's pretty disheartening, to be honest. Does it happen a lot?
Yeah.
Are there other examples of where political influence distorts economic policy?
Unfortunately, yes. It's something to be aware of whenever we're talking about economic policy.
Okay.
The decisions that get made, the policies that get enacted, they're not always based on what's best for society as a whole. Often they reflect the interests of those with the most power and influence.
So how can we know which policies are genuinely intended to benefit everyone and which ones are just disguised handouts to special interests?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It requires critical thinking, looking beyond the rhetoric and trying to understand who benefits from a particular policy and who might be disadvantaged.
Right.
It's about being informed, engaged, and maybe even a little skeptical.
It all seems so complicated. I'm starting to feel like I need a PhD in economics and political science just to understand what's going on.
Well, it's definitely a complex topic, but I think the key takeaway here is that the economy isn't some abstract, self-regulating system that operates independently of human choices and political decisions.
Okay.
It's very much a human creation shaped by our values, our institutions, and the way we organize ourselves as a society.
So even though we started with this idea of the invisible hand guiding the market, it sounds like there are a lot of very visible hands at play as well.
Absolutely. And understanding those visible hands, understanding the political and social forces that shape economic outcomes is crucial if we want to create a more just and equitable economic system.
So we've gone on quite a journey, haven't we? It feels like we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We started with, this seemingly simple idea of the invisible hand, and we ended up uncovering a whole web of complexities.
Yeah, like we saw how the ideal conditions for a free market to work perfectly are almost never met in the real world.
Right.
And how even businesses that, are always like singing the praises of free markets don't always play by the rules when it comes to their own bottom line.
Yeah, and we learned that governments actually play a much bigger role in the economy than I think some people realize. Stepping in with fiscal policies to try to stabilize things or stimulate growth.
And then we explored how political forces, interest groups, and power dynamics can really distort economic policies, leading to outcomes that, benefit the few at the expense of the many.
Yeah, it's enough to make your head spin.
It really is.
Yeah.
But it's also been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I'm starting to see the world through a different lens now.
That's what we're hoping for, to challenge your assumptions and give you a deeper understanding of how the economy really works,
So after all of this, where do we land on that initial question about Adam Smith's invisible hand?
Right.
Is it a force for good? Is it a convenient myth? Or is it something in between?
I think it's safe to say that the real world is far more nuanced than, any simple metaphor can really capture. The invisible hand might be a useful concept for understanding, some basic economic principles, but it's clearly not the whole story.
Right, and as we've seen, there are plenty of visible hands at work as well, shaping the economy in ways that aren't always transparent or beneficial.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? What can you take away from this deep dive?
Well, I hope that you'll approach economic news and policy debates with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah, don't just accept things at face value.
Right. Question the assumptions, dig deeper, and try to understand, who benefits from a particular policy and who might be disadvantaged.
Because as we've learned, the economy isn't some, abstract force operating independently of human choices.
Right. It's very much a human creation shaped by our decisions, our values, and the institutions we create.
So the next time you hear someone talking about the invisible hand or free markets or government intervention, remember that there's always more to the story.
Yeah, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep challenging your assumptions about how the world works.
It's the best way to make sure that the economy serves everyone and not just the privileged few.
Well said.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Remember, the economy is ultimately a reflection of us, our choices, and our values.
So let's make it a reflection we can all be proud of.
Until next time, keep diving deeper.